Mr. Foxley's permission, I would like to give a lady the last word, which is Dr. Mehran at the end, and also an Afghan the last word. So as of now, I would invite Mr. Foxley to present his views.
Yes, hello. Thanks, Junaid. Yeah, my name is Tim Foxley. I'm a political military analyst. 10 years or so ago, I worked for the British government looking at Afghanistan. But for 10 years, I don't work for any government or any organization. I just want to make that clear. I don't speak for anyone or any organization except for myself, based on my own kind of studies and observations. I try and be humble about my limitations of knowledge looking at Afghanistan. I've looked at Afghanistan for 20 years, and I know that it's not a very long period of time, particularly for people who have been connected with Afghanistan all their lives. I'm very grateful to be part of this discussion, and credit to Junaid and the team for getting this together. I think it also means we need to be quite cautious. There's a lot of dust and heat up in the air at the moment. Normally, as a long-term analyst, I like to kind of wait and see a little bit before I can start projecting ahead as to what may or may not happen. I've got quite a broad remit, as broad as you can get, really. Taliban, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, civil war in Afghanistan, future trajectories. So I'm going to push out a few broad thoughts and comments. And I want to start with 20 years ago, which was when I first started looking at Afghanistan. In fact, when the Taliban collapsed in November, December 2001, I'd been looking at Afghanistan for 3 weeks. And that gives you a sense, perhaps, of the way the West was scrambling and suddenly discovered that there's this place called Afghanistan, and there was a lot of problems going on. So, you know, that gives you a sense of how the West was having to suddenly reorientate itself. At the end of 2001, December, we had a Bonn conference, and the Northern Alliance were gathered around, and a lot of the key stakeholders, the key power brokers, thrashed out a deal, and it began the process for a series of interim and transitional administrations, which led to Hamid Karzai being elected the first president and elected again, and then on to Ashraf Ghani. And what I've heard from more or less 2002 onwards, from a lot better experts than me, was, of course, what we should have done at the Bonn conference was bring the Taliban in. They were defeated, they were looking to surrender, they wanted to talk and engage, and they were shut out by the Northern Alliance, who were the victors. They wanted the loot, the booty, they wanted the spoils, they wanted the plum cabinet positions, defense ministry, interior, and they were dishing all these prizes out. And the message was also always, what should have happened was we should have brought the Taliban in at this point. And we fast forward 20 years and we look at the situation where we are now. And perhaps in 5-10 years' time, we're going to be saying, well, of course, what the Taliban should have done was look to the losers, the defeated, the former government, and attempted to bring them in and embrace them. So, you know, file this under the heading of, have we learned nothing? This seems to be almost just a simple flip of the coin. One side is kicked out, another side rushes in. And again, I haven't been able to process all the government positions in detail that we just announced yesterday, but it seems like the Taliban have rushed in, they're dishing out the pieces of the pie to their friends, to their mates, to the winners, without any consideration or concession or even recognition that there's a whole massive section of Afghanistan, ethnic groups, the population, the communities that are not being represented. This is the mullahs, this is the grey and black beards. These are 90% Pashtuns, these are 50% Kandahari Pashtuns. I think half of them are on some kind of sanctions list. So I'm pessimistic about the future because I think I can see history repeating itself. The Taliban haven't learned the lessons of being in exile for 20 years. You know, if the argument was you should have brought the losing side in, they don't seem to have shown any consideration or recognition that maybe this is their responsibility now look to do. So it's clearly the end of one chapter and the start of a very new and very concerning chapter. As I see the Taliban and their victory, they are a minority force. It's by the power of the gun. It's 70, 80,000 armed fighters. I can't see any evidence that they are, inverted commas, popular in any recognizable sense. They've taken power at gunpoint. There were no demonstrations and flag wavings of a grateful Kabuli population to have been liberated by the Taliban. And they don't seem to have any intention of putting their popularity to the test with any form of election, democratic process, perhaps not even a Loya Jirga or similar. And I wondered as I watched the scenes in Kabul, and I wondered what these young Taliban fighters that have come in from wherever they're coming from Helmand, from Kandahar, from Nangarhar, wherever, what they make of this, because their propaganda has told them for years that they are the victorious popular mujahideen liberating their country from the infidels and from the puppet infidels of the Ashraf Ghani government. And yet, when they set foot into Kabul, everyone seems to run screaming away from them. Now that pattern has reversed slightly now because the women are getting up and in their face and protesting and provoking and challenging the Taliban. But I wonder what the Taliban fighters make of this. I wonder what the Taliban leadership make of this. They can't fool themselves much longer that they are popular in any sense. We've seen resistance, and that's been mentioned earlier, the fighting in the Panjshir. I've struggled to put that in context. I don't think the Panjshir fighting is a particularly relevant issue at the moment, and by which I mean, I think that was the dying embers of the last government. That was the last Commando Special Forces, with a rallying point. I mean, the Panjshir is a mythical kind of legendary place, and it's the natural place to go to. And I think the Panjshir has a place to play, but not now. I think 12 months, 24 months, maybe it'll become a natural rallying point for any form of resistance. But again, we see the mistakes that the Taliban are making in the Panjshir. The Americans and British soldiers could have told them, you go to Helmand with 10,000 soldiers and you can go there and you can put up a flag and say, look, we control Helmand. I'll be great. We've pacified the place. We are now the winners. But you don't control the Panjshir. You can occupy it with a few thousand fighters, but when you leave, you no longer control it. And if you stay there, in the end, you can expect IEDs, ambushes, sniping, assassinations. So I'm looking with interest to see how quickly the Taliban entirely forget the days in resistance as guerrilla fighters and start to make all the mistakes that the Ghani government made, and the Americans and the British and the soldiers who were fighting against guerrilla forces. The Taliban have a lot of challenges. All eyes are on them. I mean, all eyes. Afghans, journalists, NGOs, neighboring countries, aid agencies, the United States, of course, Western governments, and the Taliban commanders and fighters at the lower level are looking up to see what they do. So it's an unenviable position for them, for the leadership. And I fully get this sense that they are trying to juggle kind of impossible demands from all sides. They need to consolidate control. They need to present business as usual. They need to slow the brain drain, the flood of people trying to leave. These are the people that they desperately will need to rebuild Afghanistan. Ironically, these are the same people that they were trying to assassinate even a few weeks ago. So they need to do this. They need to stop or prevent any kind of armed resistance. They need to get forms of international recognition. They need to free up assets, unlock funds, a lot of things they've got to be done. And once they've consolidated at some level, they've basically got to deliver three things: governance, human rights, and counterterrorism. And these are things that I don't believe, this would be a challenge for any government. I don't think the Taliban have the skill sets for these. I don't think a lot of these areas, they don't have the willingness to do it. I don't think they will prove up to the job. I think they'll find, and put it bluntly, I think they'll find it's easier to blow up governments than to rebuild them. And at the moment, I mean, we've had the fighting and the violence and the seizing of power. We have major, major economic and humanitarian problems. We have the drought, we have food insecurity, we have massive population displacement. This might be 5 or 6 million Afghans. Right at the point when international assistance has mainly stopped. Now, some of this international assistance might turn back on again and probably quite quickly, but a major hiatus in the aid at the moment. I'm also looking with interest to see how the Taliban deal with two things, with counter-terrorism, counter-insurgency, as Brits and Americans who call it CT and COIN, those sort of things, how they would address this now they are the government and having to deal with terrorists. I wonder if they will be seduced by these American weapons that they've got, these Humvees, MRAPs, helicopters, aircraft, and whether they'll be itching next time there's some resistance to start flying aircraft and bombing people, and whether they'll slowly forget the lessons of being a guerrilla force. I'm also interested to see, and this has already come up from the others, how they will deal with public protest and criticism of their approach, their governance, the way they do business. It was one thing to be hiding behind a website. It's another thing to have an articulate spokesman, Mr. Zabihullah Mujahid, issuing cleverly crafted tweets. But they are now overt and publicly in Kabul. And as we've seen, particularly from women grouping together regularly now for many days, the criticism is now public, it's now popular, and it's going to be in their face every day, as far as I can see. So it'll be interesting to see. My suspicion is that they will beat people and they will arrest journalists and they'll confiscate cameras. And that is an answer in itself if we want to know how the Taliban are going to be. Now, I guess the greatest concern for the international community, particularly the Americans, is what's going to happen about terrorist groups in Afghanistan, in and around Afghanistan. There are major expectations tied into this. I think there are some groups that the Taliban may try to control. There are some groups that they may not be able to control, and others they may not wish to control. I think we know roughly how that's going to pan out. And I think, Junaid, I think you said there are many terrorist groups already encouraged, sorry, maybe it's Dorothy, encouraged by Taliban success and looking to emulate this sort of success. If the Taliban can do it, why can't we? As far afield as Africa, Syria, Iraq, but more close to home as well, Pakistani Taliban, TTP. I heard the spokesman, Mujahid, Zabihullah Mujahid, make a favourable mention to fellow Muslims in Kashmir as well. We may see some of these modern weapons that the Taliban have got leak out of Afghanistan, leaking into neighbouring countries and into neighbouring conflicts. But to try and be fair on the Taliban, I don't think they want this to happen. I don't think they want to be the safe haven for terrorist groups. So I don't think they will be projecting out in favour of terrorist groups, but who knows what Al-Qaeda will get up to. And I think the main concern, of course, is Al-Qaeda. The UN said in June this year that Taliban was still connected to Al-Qaeda. A significant part of the AQ leadership is in the border areas, the AFPAC, Afghanistan-Pakistan border areas. And Afghan and foreign fighters and Al-Qaeda fight co-located with the Taliban during the recent fighting. And obviously the Haqqani network, which is now a major subset of this new Taliban government, has very strong links to Al-Qaeda. The Taliban have made vague commitments to prevent Afghanistan being a launch pad. The Taliban are very good in their media of making vague commitments. It's very difficult to actually pin down what they mean on a lot of issues. We've seen that Al-Qaeda have been very quick to congratulate the Taliban on their victory. And we've even seen one Al-Qaeda commander publicly making his way back into Nangarhar province. So we have to watch this with anxious attention, see how it plays out. In terms of Islamic State, ISKP, Khorasan province franchise, they've been in Afghanistan since 2014, 2015. They've been fighting the Taliban ever since. They're a mix of, and Dorothy will correct me if I'm wrong, they're a mix of Pakistani Taliban, former Afghan Taliban, and a whole spread of foreign fighters. They suffered heavily in the last couple of years from American airstrikes against the fighters and American drone strikes against their leadership. But they still retain capability and intent, and they're responsible for some of the worst atrocities that we've seen in Afghanistan. I think Islamic State will be very keen to launch some rockets into Kabul as soon as they can. Days, weeks, months. They'll want to show that the Taliban are weak and they are strong. And if you like, the way to look at this is Islamic State are now what the Taliban were 15 years ago, and the Taliban are now the government. This is my point about how the Taliban are going to deal with counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. Prospects for a renewed conflict. I don't yet think this is inevitable. I think what the Taliban have in their favor is that the fighting has stopped. Never mind that it was the Taliban causing most of this fighting, but I think a lot of the population are enjoying this absence of war. And I guess many Afghans would be making a calculation. There's no fighting. And if the Taliban could even partly deliver on tackling corruption, then maybe I'm prepared to reserve judgment for a bit and see how the Taliban government works out. If the Taliban deliver these three things, governance, human rights, and counterterrorism, or at least are seen to be delivering, seen to be making an effort, they don't have to be successful, but just to be seen to be doing the right thing, I think the risk of wider violence reduces. But as we all know from history, centralized government from Kabul is always hard to deliver. And I don't believe the Taliban have the skill sets to do this. And they certainly don't have an inclusive government, which is what they need to bring in the skill sets. So I'm offering one way that this could play out in 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. I think in this time frame, the Taliban will be struggling with governance and there'll still be a humanitarian crisis. Islamic State will still be in eastern Afghanistan and will have launched attacks into Kabul. The Taliban will greatly struggle to manage media, journalists, protests, demonstration. And this time the Taliban's failings will be really publicly exposed. Every time they do something wrong, it will be pointed out. And this is the way the Taliban worked with their media operation. They let the Western mistakes speak for themselves. It just amplified them. So a large part of resistance to the Taliban will not be violent. It'll come from the public protests, particularly the women's protests. They seem to be particularly effective because it freaks out the Taliban. I don't think they really understand how to deal with this. And it's in full view with social media and public. And maybe we could call this resistance 2.0, since we all seem to be trying to put 2.0 over everything at the moment to do with Afghanistan. Worst case, we've got a potential for 2 or 3 different types of civil war or internal conflict. We've got this potential for the Panjshir Valley, Bamiyan, possibly specific areas of resistance developing in direct response to the Taliban. We've got the potential for Islamic State in the east. We have multiple warlord groups inevitably waiting in the wings. The warlords, Ismail Khan, Dostum, Atta, if they're not in government, they're in exile, plotting their return. So, I mean, we can't entirely write them out. So we have 2 or 3 different ways in which the resistance and the fighting could amplify. I don't think it'll happen yet, but in 6 months, 12 months, 24 months time, I think that's where we might be heading, particularly having seen what the Taliban have done with their government approach. So I'll bring it to a halt. In conclusion, I'm quite pessimistic. What we've seen initially from the Taliban shows that they haven't really learned many lessons, and their intent, as was the Northern Alliance 20 years ago, in dividing up the pie amongst themselves without really the skill sets or understanding or empathy to do what is necessary for Afghanistan.
Thank you, Mr. Tim Foxley. Very interesting. While you keep saying you're pessimistic, and indeed, it shows that things are not going to be better soon. But I do think it has a positive angle, because although you don't say it, but I think with the resistance coming, especially from women, you probably also foresee the Taliban not governing the country for long. On the other hand, there is, of course, a bad effect from that, is that the normal population of Afghanistan is going to suffer for a long time to come. So while it's very pessimistic and the world needs to pay attention to that, at the same time, the things you mentioned, governance, human rights, and counterterrorism, well, those are not the exact things the Taliban has been known for.